I put up a video not long ago talking about hard to listen to and how everything today feels so hard to listen to. Granted, this is a bit of a generalization because there's so many people making mixes and so many genres, but I'm just talking about the average of what I listen to. And it seems from what I put down and how many people seem to agree with me that I'm not the only one who feels that most of the stuff I listen to has a tendency to wear my ears down. And it's across multiple genres. Let's talk about some of the most popular comments that were received on that video. One of them that I thought was great is about how the freaking 808s keep following us around. Like from genre to genre. I'm trying to find it here, but let me pull this up. Here we go. 90s and early 2000s is so fun to listen to. After 2016, everyone is using the same bass, the same kick, even the same 808. It doesn't matter if you're listening to rap, pop, or country. How is it the same 808 following me everywhere and everyone's just acting like they like this shit? I love that comment. This is by Ty Sand. Exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter how technically good you can record something. Everyone who knows how to record things at one point didn't. At one point started out and made a few mistakes. And sometimes the mistakes are actually the best parts of recordings because you would have never done it had it not been for the mistake. Glyn Johns, his technique of the Glyn Johns miking technique came largely in part from the fact that Jimmy Page flipped around to record his guitar when they were doing some Zeppelin stuff, and then the mic was where it was when it was time to record more drum stuff, and it was panned a certain way, and he just said, wow, what's going on? It's great. And he would have never set it up that way had it not been for that mistake. So the mistakes bring us often to techniques and ways of doing things that really improve things for everybody who ever does anything. It's really kind of amazing. And by using samples that are all the same, by picking from sound libraries, you just really limit yourself because now you're using the same stuff that everyone else has used before. So your song has to be even more special and unique because so much of it sounds just like everything else. Now, there's other parts to this. If you come to the table trying to sell units, like if that's your purpose for making music, you want to sell units, you're actually in business to make widgets. You're not making art. And the reason is because if you're trying to sell widgets, then you don't care how unique something is. If it sounds close to other things, you think you'll capture a certain market and that'll work. That's one way to look at it. In my opinion, it's not the way to look at it if you're trying to make music that moves people, because it has to be some kind of surprise and some kind of difference and unique things within it in order to move people. If I'm not surprised, I don't care to listen to it again. If it doesn't give me something that's like a turn, some weird unexpected part, in my opinion, that's the best kind of music. It has to surprise me. It has to be somehow different. There's so many parts to this. Another part to this is a band can't sound unique if you're blending in the same sounds 100,000 other people have used and done before. So what does that mean? It means it's never really a unique product from this band. It's always this conglomeration of the same sounds we've heard before, which for more people than you even realize just turns them off completely. It might not turn off the lemmings, the sheep. So you'll maybe get some of those, which, like I said, might be good if you're trying to herd sheep. If you're not trying to herd sheep and you're actually trying to get people who are interested in what you're doing and who value you as an artist, then going that way is probably not the best move. Now, this is just my opinions, of course, but I have them, so I feel like I should share them. Now, something else, the main part of that video was basically how, like, what is it that when I put on so many things today, it really just beats my ears down? What is it? And a lot of people answered compression, and a lot of people answered saturation. Like, that's unanimously what the most people think the answer is. And my theory is that whenever, like, I agree with you guys, compression, saturation, 100%, that's definitely it. Over compressing things gets wearing on the ears. And it's the same when you oversaturate. Now, a lot of people in the comments, were very clear that they feel, back in the day, there was no saturation plug-in, but saturation was inherent in the gear. So as a result, you had saturation, but here's the nuance. The caveat is you were fighting it every step of the way. In other words, there'd be too much dirt. You'd want as clean as you could get. So you're fighting against it. And as a result, you were able to get things that sounded very, very good because you weren't leaning into the dirt and the gross and the grime and putting it there. It's human nature. When you have a dial that goes to 11, you want to crank to 11. Now, I'm putting a B in there because it sounds like that in the accents of the Spinal Tap guys when he's like, well, these go to 11. But the point is, if you have 11, you go to 11. So when people have now a dial that they can turn up for cranking grit, distortion, they're gonna. And not only are they gonna, they're gonna turn it up till it feels good, which is usually too much because now you can notice it. But the problem is you stop noticing it over enough time. And that's just the way our ears work. If you've ever mixed something for a long enough time without taking breaks, which is a bad idea, you know that you could keep going brighter and brighter. And it feels like anything less than that is too dark. Then you listen the next morning and you go, why is this thing like the sun? I've done it before. I've stayed up like all night trying to finish something and then thought it was great. And the next day been like, this is the worst thing I've ever done. And you have to go in and just take away all that brightness you added on the top. And that's because we get used to things. So if you think by putting on a saturation plugin that you think is helpful works, you might think that at that moment in time, and then you get used to it, and then you start compounding that effect by putting it on a lot of things, by putting it on the mix bus. Once you start combining this stuff, it gets way, way, way worse. And you don't even realize it because you haven't taken the time to make another mix without the stuff on it. That to me is the most telling thing. In my understanding of this, I've gone back to some of the stuff I was working on over the past 6-8 months. And I just would pull up the mix, bring up, what was going on, take off, literally bypass all the plugins on the mix bus except for 3 or 4. Usually just a limiter, a bus compressor, hit very lightly. So in other words, I would just bypass everything. Start again with this new mindset of almost no bus compression, little bit. A limiter doing very little, because at least if you come at it from the point of view of do very little, inevitably, by the time you get done, it's going to be doing a little bit more than that. But if you started with the thought of, I don't want to add much, at least at the end, you're in a place where it's still not overdone. So that's really the thing. If you come at it from the point of view of, I need 4 dB of compression, by the end, you're doing 8 to 10 or 12 on the mix bus, for example, and then it's a disaster. So human nature is to overdo and to try it more. And I'm not opposed to people trying things and experimenting, but follow that through to the end. That line of thinking ends with you trying it also the other way. Because if you don't do that, you never have a reference point of whether it worked or not. All you do is have this thing you did that you're now so invested in because of all the time you put in that you want to believe it's great. But if you never really take it off to try it, you never really know what you're missing out on. That's at least what I found. Somebody else left a great comment. So if you stuck around till here, you're going to hear something else I thought was great. They said, talking about the way a lot of these saturation plugins are built and designed, they don't often take into account what used to happen with tape. So what used to happen on a lot of anything with a noise floor that was not as quiet as digital is. What would happen is at a certain point, signal would get eaten up by the noise floor. Whereas now things linger longer. You never really lose the signal. So as a result of all this stuff, we hear and our ears never get a break from certain things that would have faded away when their noise floor was a relatively substantial problem or an issue or something we were always fighting. So every single tape machine had, you were combating that. And every single console, you were combating that. And even the ones that were clean, were not all the way clean. So as a result, things disappeared. So their answer for how to deal with that was use things like an expander, basically a gentle gate that will eliminate sound at a certain point to keep it from lingering. And I found that to be an interesting idea. And they thought about, if they had known, what they said was if they knew a plugin designer, this and that, they would talk to him about creating something like that. So, that's an idea. It's definitely one that I haven't really heard of or thought about much before. However, I do know a lot of saturation plugins have a noise option you could turn on, but I'm not sure if it does this thing that we're talking about really, if it has like a built-in expander function, like a gentle gate to get rid of that stuff at a certain point, the way a noise floor might. So I find that interesting. And the other big thing that a lot of people think about when they hear this is, they think tape saturation and console transformers and multiple stages of that. I've heard Eric Valentine talking about it. It wasn't just like one transformer. By the time the thing got through to the end of, the whole chain through the console, first of all, through the console, then to some kind of multi-track, then from there played back to the console, then to another, half inch or whatever to print the thing. By the time it got done, it hit so many layers of transformers, which people say it's like, that's what the purpose is of all these. That's obviously what the design was, why they created all these saturation and tape plugins. However, that's not doing it in the same way. And my theory is, no matter what you think about needing to do what you're doing, because you have a knob that you can turn up these things that are distorting and saturating and all the stuff that you are using to try to get to where you think things were back in the day, you're always going to be doing the saturation stuff it's going to sound completely different. It's not made in a way that will sound that way, because even through all that, my theory, and a lot of people seem to be writing this kind of thing in the comments, so they believe it too, they're saying, and I'm saying, no matter how much or like how little you hit those plugins, you're still doing way more than was ever done when it was just running through 6 or 8 transformers to get to the end. It's still way, way more in plugin form than it ever was then, and it's different. And the difference is, in a short sentence to sum it up, it's not the same as it would be if it was running through the hardware, and there's a ton more negative effects that come out when you add these things that do the saturation through the ones and zeros. So the way I look at this also in a positive light a little bit is that so many plugins nowadays have a lot of that built into it, where you don't really need to go out searching for more. That is the inherent problem, I think, that so many people should take from this, is that 20, 30 years ago, plugins had probably none of that in it. Now they all have that in it. So as a result, you don't need to add more, because by doing that, you're adding way too much. Even though you may be adding very little on a bunch of different things, it's still way too much. And like I said, the only way you would really know that is if you tried it both ways, with stuff on and without the stuff on, and then really, really check yourself. It's the only way you'll know. And that the other part of human nature is, when we buy stuff, we want to use it. Every time I bought a saturation plugin, it's just happenstance that I use it on the next 10 to 20 mixes. No, it's because I want to use it, because I bought it. So that's the inherent problem too. I own 20 different saturation plugins or something. I haven't ever counted it up, but a ton of them. And is it because, I own them that I use them? In large part, yes. So by looking at it like you don't want to use them and you shouldn't want to use them, just check your results like that. All I could tell you is that from my point of view, we've gone so far, the pendulum has swung so far in the direction of digital is too clean, we need saturation, we need distortion, it's swung so far that way that we are so over the cliff with what we're doing. So far. So anyway, you guys, a lot of your comments are awesome, Intrinsic recording, 2 kilohertz to 5 kilohertz is ouchy in the digital age if you're not careful. Also, digital takes everything you throw at it, whereas tape didn't. So when you squeeze up all these tracks, you end up with a situation with too much information. Filtering can help. Also, expansion can help. This is that comment. Things used to trail off into the background and noise floor of tape and analog consoles. So things used to trail off into the background in the noise floor of tape and analog consoles. Now, it never really does with modern dynamic range. When you limit too hard on a digital mix bus, you bring all this stuff up, creating digital glare. It's a great way to put it, digital glare, which I think is what you're referring to as blurriness. In my humble opinion, I think this is one of the things that should be modeled more accurately in tape emulation. The lack of dynamic range and the way high frequency used to die off on analog tape. I don't have the skill set to design a tape plugin, so I can't criticize. I'm very aware that I'm probably doing something when I add any kind of tape saturation plugin that's actually helping for the moment, but not helping in the long run to make things easy to listen to over and over and over, the way things were before we got all crazy digital. So I'm not blind to the fact that that's the case. So I can't criticize. I sometimes put an expander on things to die off faster and have less sustain in the top end to emulate a console and tape machine. This can create more space in your mix like the old days. The opposite of compression. Great video. Thanks very much for making it. So I just had to throw that out there because, in my opinion, this kind of thing, incredibly helpful to consider, to think about, and we all want to make music that's easy to listen to. That's like my number one goal now. Do the drums sound real? Not do they sound pro and huge and giant. Do they sound real? Which usually means, can I get away with no samples? Can I get away with the real sound that was there? If I have to use samples, just blend it in ever so gently where they're not even really noticeable. They're just adding length, like very particular samples, just the noise part of it sometimes, just to add length to it, sometimes just to trigger a verb, to trigger something else and not even hear the sample. I mean, there's so many ways to look at it. And sometimes you have no choice because you got a ton of cymbal bleed or something like we talked about in another video. But I just find this stuff very helpful, very critical stuff to talk about. So I'm really curious what you guys think. But this kind of thing, makes me want really badly to turn on the analog summing and just compare something else with an in-the-box mix. Because even no matter how happy I get in the box, I am always fighting constantly the idea that fatigue on the ear is the enemy, because that's just a part of our tools today. And when we fight for loudness, we fight for harshness. Don't be thinking loudness war. Be thinking harshness war. Be thinking of it's like a salt shaker on the table, and as you go louder, you go harsher. And this is the problem. I think people need to change how their brain calibrates loud. It's not helping to make your stuff loud to compete with other stuff. Somebody else, I got to add this real quick because I just can't shut up. But it's somebody who's talking about in the DJ world, it's helpful to hear how a song goes in and out from another song. And they were a DJ. And it occurred to me years ago, I went to this party that a friend of mine was throwing at a local bar. And he basically was spinning a lot of stuff that I like. It wasn't the top 40 anything. It was old school, alternative rock, some classic rock, some funk in there, old school rap. It was just so much stuff that all sounded so different. And he told me later that it was like such a pain to make the levels close enough where when one song would go to the next, it wasn't such a crazy change because the song sounded so different, every one of them. The volumes on them, every one was different. So matching and lining that up was very difficult. But as a listener, my immediate response when I heard that was, I had no idea. All I know is everything sounded great. Everything sounded different. And when one song was a little lower than the other, you turned it up a little and nobody cared. It became so obvious that something needed to be cranked, and it was. So it's like the volume knob solved all these issues everybody gives a crap about making everything the same level. if you've seen that video on Colt's channel he just dropped today, where he talks about how Spotify's new terms of service are basically so they can take your stuff, they can change it, they can make it where it's not even you as the author. You don't have to be credited as the author. They're clearly positioning themselves to be able to take and to be able to make stuff through AI and have nobody be able to sue them and have nobody ever really maintain the rights to their own stuff that decide they want to use those platforms. So as a result, when you consider that, why is everyone so concerned with the volume on a platform like that if your stuff makes a playlist? Who cares? You're getting bent over on all the playlists every which way. Like, why do you even care if you're on there? Because it doesn't, pretty soon these things are all going to collapse because greed is the number one destroyer of everything. And that is ripe with greed. The last thing they care about is the artists. The last thing they care about is your intellectual property. So if you haven't seen that video, you should watch it because it's very, very telling on what's about to happen. But what I'm saying is all of us that make the music, we're ahead of the pack on this thing. We understand what's going to happen, and we understand how destructive it is to try to make our stuff competitive with all the stuff that beats on your eardrums and makes it hurt. So as a result, get out of there. Who cares? Put a different idea in your head, which is people might be willing to buy this stuff directly, in which case I'll make a ton more money and sell a fraction of the stuff. And if I'm not trying to make money, if I'm just trying to make people hear my stuff, the stuff will sound so much better also. There's just so many ways to look at this. It's like, make it sound as good as you can. Stop the harshness wars. That's what it is. It's the harshness war. Comment, like, subscribe. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.